Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Web Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians. The Russians managed to advance in the northeastern outskirts of the Donetsk region in the vicinity of Leman, to the southwest of Pocrosk, and the fighting continues to the east of the city. The Russians also managed to advance in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the eastern parts of it, as well as in the southwestern parts of the front line in the Zaporizhzhia region between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians continue their advances to the south of Stepnohirsk, gaining control over the apartment complex area to the south of the settlement and regaining control over the highway area east of Plavny. The Russians have been operating on the northern and southern bank of the river line, going through the south of Stepnohirsk, clearing the positions from Ukrainian forces and redirecting the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians from a concentrated point to a wider area. This allowed them to gain control over the apartment complex area through positional battles to the west and to the east of it, and now the Russians have managed to gain full control of it, as we see with this geolocated footage. The Russian objective in this section of the front line is to gain control over the western flank of the first line of defense within the Zaporizhzhia region. Taking a look at the western outskirts of it, between the first and second lines of defense there is a gap between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. If the Russians are able to gain control over the fortified positions at the midpoint between the first and second line of defense, they'll have a buffer zone between their forces operating alongside the defensive line, and they'll be able to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the first line of defense alongside the western flank of Oryhiv as they continue their pressure on the eastern and southern flanks of the town, which acts as the main logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces in this section of the front line. The Russians are already operating on the eastern flank of the first and second lines of defense within the Zaporizhzhia region. Attacking from both flanks will speed up the process of the Russian forces capturing the first and second lines of defense. Gaining control over both Oryhiv and Hulyaipole will completely secure the first line of defense and increase the pressure on the second line of defense, as the Russians will be able to make use of these logistical hubs for their own offensive operations, reaching the second offensive line in several areas and connecting with the forces on the eastern flank, especially capturing Hulyaipole and gaining control over the northeastern outskirts of the second line of defense will allow the Russians to flank the second line of defense as well through Hulyaipole, acting as the main supply hub. Connecting to Omelnik to the northeast of Oryhiv will also allow the Russians to make use of Oryhiv as a logistical hub to flank the second line of defense as well. Simply gaining control over the first line of defense and everything to the north and east of Oryhiv will allow the Russians to establish offensive operations towards the Dnipropetrovsk region and northeastern outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia region and threaten Zaporizhzhia city itself from the northeast. This means that the Russians are developing offensive operations by preparing the battlefield, by attacking the flanks of these defensive positions, creating a gap in the Ukrainian defenses, and attacking it from the weak points to establish control over logistical hubs for larger concentrations of forces and bypassing the defensive lines of the Ukrainians. To the northeast, the Russians have managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Sosnivka, the northwestern road. With this, the Russians have gained control over the final settlement here to the south of the river line, branching from the Vovcha river line here to the northwest. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the second defensive line in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions. Now the large area between Ternova in the east and Kalinivske in the west is isolated from the supply lines of the Ukrainians to the north. This allows the Russians to redirect their forces down the main road from Sosnivka in the north, down to Ternova and the Berezova in the south, and to gain control over the fortified positions along the wedge here, gaining control over which will cover about half the distance between the Russian positions and the highway to the north of Hulyaipole, which again is one of the main logistical hubs for the Ukrainian forces in the area, and will also allow the Russians to strengthen defensive operations on the first line of defense, advancing through their main road here to the east, connecting to Velika Novosilka to the rear of Hulyaipole from the northeast. There is also a lot of Russians to combine offensive operations from the east, southeast, and south towards the town itself, where the main logistics and supply hubs will come from the north, as the pressure from multiple directions. Further north, the Russians managed to continue defensive operations within Moravka as they managed to gain control of the southern strait, leaving just the northern strait under Ukrainian control as they continue to develop offensive operations to gain control over the logistical roads leading into the town to supply their forces and to gain control over the town itself to put pressure on the hourglass formation just west of the settlement and gain control over the Donetsk-Dnipropetrovsk border before developing offensive operations towards Novopavlivka itself, which will be the first logistical hub under Russian control within the Dnipropetrovsk region, despite a much larger push into the southern outskirts of the region. To the east of Pocrosk, there's a lot of fighting taking place where both the Russian and Ukrainian forces are storming each other's positions. The Ukrainians are mainly pushing through the industrial area up towards Razine, where they're looking to gain control over the river line itself, while the Russian forces are looking to flank the positions of the Ukrainians by advancing to the south of Novokhnamishne, looking to cut off the supply line to the Ukrainian forces, create a pocket for the Ukrainian forces operating along the river line, and to flank their positions. The Russians have been geolocated to the southeast of Mirnorod, where the Ukrainians have been geolocated within the central parts of Novokhnamishne, and according to Deep State Map are advancing towards Razine from the south. Moving up further north in the direction of Leman, the Russians continue offensive operations within Zaporizhzhia, getting control over the central parts and western parts of the settlement, putting the Ukrainians in two separate parts: the central parts, which remains under their control along the fortified positions that is connected to the northern road, and the southern part along the fortified positions on the outskirts of the settlement, where the Ukrainians have their forces concentrated outside the settlement itself, leaving the majority of the settlement in a gray zone or under Russian control, while they themselves are operating from the fortified positions. The Ukrainians have difficulty supplying their forces in the northwest of Zaporizhzhia and the central parts due to the Russians gaining physical control over the road between Zaporizhzhia and Stavki, which allowed the Russians to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from the rear and cut off Mirne to the north, while the Russians are developing offensive operations within the town itself, where they have stable supply lines from Torske, which is connected to Kreminne as the local logistical hub for the Russian forces in this section of the front line. Russians are slowly developing the offensive operations to gain control over the Serebets river line and to gain control over Zaporizhzhia, as well as the fortified positions on the outskirts of the settlement, which will secure a stable supply line for Russian forces to storm Leman from the east. The Russians also continue their offensive operations within Shandryholova itself, gaining control over the residential area to the south of the Nitrius River, gaining control over the river line to the north and the river line to the west, which leaves the front line in the direction of the Rilove as the only main direction for further offensive operations. While they are working on securing Shandryholova from the northern and western directions, their eastern forces will be pushing in the direction of the Rilove to cut off the roads connecting to Leman from the northwestern direction and to push in the direction of Novoselivka, Yarova, and Zaporizhzhia as well. The Russians continue their offensive operations in the direction of multiple logistical hubs of the Ukrainians that remain under Ukrainian control: Kupiansk in the north, Leman in the northeast, Kosyantinivka in the east, Pocrosk to the southeast, the Dnipropetrovsk border area along the first and second lines of defense in the Zaporizhzhia region from the east, as well as the first line of defense from the west. All of this is to develop offensive operations to gain full control over the Donetsk region, the eastern bank of the Usk river line, and the Zaporizhzhia region. Gaining control over these areas will significantly improve the positions of the Russians and establish defensive lines to prevent the Ukrainians from counterattacking and regaining control over these areas, while developing offensive operations towards the Kherson direction or Kiev itself in the north. It allowed the Russians to redirect a lot of their forces from the southern and eastern section of the front line to the northern section of the front line or across the Dnieper River for future offensive operations to Kherson, potentially expanding to Mykolaiv and Odessa. The Russian offensive operations are only limited to what the general staff are stating. As for their offensive capability, it is ever increasing. As for the developments within Poland last night, I was following it live as it was happening due to the severity of what was happening. 19 to 23 drones of a cheaper version that is usually a decoy drone, but can also be used for reconnaissance. This type of drone, it has a limited range of 700 kilometers, yet it reached deep into Poland, both into the central parts here to the southwest of Warsaw, as well as Olsztyn to the south of Kaliningrad. Reportedly, these drones flew through Minsk and into Poland from Belarus, while some also flew through the northern parts of Ukraine. The question here is, what is the purpose? Was it a mistake? Was it intentional? If it was a mistake, then that is where it ends. If it was intentional, then there are two ways to determine what the objective was. The first one is testing NATO response. Then at that point, it is also ended because the Russians now know how NATO responds to such an occasion. The second possibility is reconnaissance. That is, if these drones were equipped with reconnaissance equipment, then they would give information back to Russia, locations of military gatherings, logistical hubs, transportation, military installations, and so on. The purpose of such a reconnaissance mission would be either to attack supplies going into Ukraine as soon as it crosses the border, or a future attack against Poland itself. And that is why it is so important to follow the situation, because the options varies from a simple mistake or the complicated issue of potentially preparing for a war. Zapat 2025 is happening in just 2 days. The Russians will have a large gathering of troops within Belarus for this training period, both within Belarus and in north of the country and the western parts of Russia. Why this matters is because Russia has previously used Zapat 2021 to prepare for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In 2021, in September, the Russian forces gathered within Belarus and western parts of Russia, where they then left their equipment behind once they left following these exercises. Then when the war began, the equipment was already at the border, the infantry just needed to move, and everything was prepared. If the Russians do a similar maneuver, they could prepare for a battle against NATO or an offensive towards Ukraine from the north and the east from new borders. Which will happen, if any of these will happen, we do not know. It is based purely on the intention of the Russian General Staff. And that is all I can say on that topic. That is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.